We're joined by the Honourable Andrew Scheer, the Leader of Canada's official opposition. Mr. Scheer, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on.
How are you doing? How are you holding up throughout this?
Well, like every Canadian family right now, it's a little bit stressful. We've got 5 kids all in the house pretty much all day, so we're trying to keep them off their iPhones and iPods and getting them reading a bit more and catching up with their homework. But our thoughts are with all the families who are struggling right now and very very much worried about how they're going to make ends meet at the end of the month.
This was obviously an unprecedented move that, and to be honest, restricting the number of people in the House of Commons in order to get this piece of legislation through quickly. And I know you were pretty quick, the opposition, quite quick out of the gate to say there were things that were not discussed that ended up in that legislation. Was it the responsible thing to do to delay this implementation when people are hurting and needing this money, that you needed to, as opposition, hold the government to account and not necessarily ask for unprecedented powers till the end of 2020?
Well, I just remind you that it was the government's choice to link the aid package with unprecedented new powers. They did not need to do that. They could have, as I said to the Prime Minister Tuesday morning, they could have seen that bill pass within a couple of hours. We were willing to support it. We wanted it to get done quickly. They were the ones that chose to write in a whole bunch of new powers. And it is important. It is important to preserve our democratic institutions. Just because we're going through a very serious crisis is no reason to abandon the very types of institutions that make our society so strong. Our House of Commons and our model of holding the government to account has survived 2 world wars, other health crises, massive labor unrest at various points of time in our history. It's precisely now that we should be strengthening those institutions, not weakening them.
Andrew Scheer is our guest. Mr. Scheer, when we flew Canadians out of China and we brought them back and repatriated them to Canada, we put them in isolation for 14 days. There's been a lot said about what should have been done, what could have been done. Did we have the questions? Were we given the opportunity to ask government why perhaps they weren't expanding the screening in airports, given that we're at a situation even still that it's voluntary? We're asking people to return to Canada, but we're not necessarily making sure testing them before they go back into community.
Well, it's becoming more and more clear that the government has not managed this crisis well. They have been all over the map. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were calling for the government to close the border and restrict travel from people who were coming in from countries with that had experienced a major spike, such as Italy. They refused to do so. In fact, they said that it was ineffective, that shutting down air travel would make the situation worse. Well, boy, does that ever look foolish today. And they were late to restrict the travel. They were late to implement the measures, such as screening people at airports and taking more strict measures. Even this announcement about mandatory self-isolation comes weeks after other countries made such isolations mandatory for people who are traveling overseas. So it seems like they're always a couple of weeks behind what other countries are doing, and as a result, the situation is where it is today. And then today we learned they sent all kinds of medical equipment to China, giving away our protective masks, protective gloves, over 50,000 masks, or over 200,000 gloves. Our medical equipment is needed by our healthcare professionals. We find out today that just before this crisis hit Canada, we emptied our shelves and gave it all to the government of China. It's ridiculous.
Andrew Scheer is here. Is that fair comment, given that the world was reacting to a crisis, that healthcare systems in an unprecedented way were being overwhelmed with people who are presenting with a rare virus that had crossed over from animals to humans, and that, in fact, we are at least given some measure of ability to prepare for this, unlike some areas where this first emerged? Is it fair comment to suggest that helping out was not the right move?
Well, let's keep in mind, China is a country with a booming economy, with a military spend in the billions and billions of dollars. For heaven's sake, they have the capacity to manufacture their own equipment. This decision was made after the World Health Organization warned other countries that this was likely to spread. that this was highly likely to spread, it would be, and every country would be hit with the virus. And I believe we need to make sure that our healthcare professionals have the tools that they need. I spoke to the president of the Ontario Medical Association, who said that one of their biggest concerns is protective equipment for healthcare workers. And now we find out that just before we saw a spike in cases here, the very equipment that our doctors and our nurses treating people with this virus, the very equipment that they need and that there is a shortage of, we gave to another country. So, it doesn't matter which country received it. I don't believe that we should be sending away the equipment that we're going to need right before a spike here at home.
Andrew Scheer is our guest on the show, and just before we let you go, this is an unprecedented time. Many have said we are at war with this pandemic, and in that example, wartime cabinet, wartime governance does take on a different tone. And I'm wondering how you're balancing the requirement as a member of the opposition to hold government to account and to also reassure Canadians that we're doing all we can.
Well, yes, and you point out a very important point that in many ways fighting a pandemic crosses partisan lines. However, it is our job to hold them to account. And while we can be cooperative and constructive, as you saw this week, we were not thrilled with the way that the government approached this. They surprised us with this power grab. But at the end of the day, once we were satisfied that accountability measures were put in, we did allow it to pass, recognizing that Canadians needed the assistance. But it's now more than ever we need critical analysis. If we have officials who tell us one day that there's no point closing the border, and then a couple of days later they're forced to close the border, well, we need to hold those people to account, because if they're not getting the job done, then we need to get people in there that can. And, our health ministers, our finance minister, they need to be held accountable so that they make either they make the right decisions, or if they aren't, then the Canadian people see what went wrong.
And I can't disagree with that, but I can perhaps suggest that if they're going on the advice of medical experts, and we're all learning through this, that perhaps you can perhaps give the government a bit of I won't say a pass, but at least recognize that these are unprecedented times. No?
Well, if we go back to the point about restricting air travel, other countries' health officials had recommended that is exactly what needs to be done. There are many, many health officials from around the world who are saying we need to start restricting travel. We need to start containing this as much as possible. So, at the end of the day, the ministers are responsible for the decisions that they make. And regardless of who they happen to listen to, they're the ones that make the final decision. And if they can't see the common sense of saying, look, there's a huge spike of cases in Italy or Iran or China, at the very least, let's stop incoming flights from those areas. If they can't see the common sense in that, well, then the Canadian people have a right to know that. And that's why we're taking the approach of being constructive and cooperative where we can. But when they make the wrong decision, when they're slow off the gate, when they give away our medical equipment right before the pandemic spikes here in Canada, you bet we're going to hold them to account for that, because they need to stop making poor choices.
The Honourable Andrew Scheer, thank you for your time. I would obviously have the tough questions for the Prime Minister if we were able to get him on the show. Thank you.